The intersection of 5th and Lexington was unremarkable on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I remember the exact shade of gray in the sky, the kind that makes you want to disappear into your jacket. My nephew Marco gripped my hand tighter as we approached the crosswalk, his 5-year-old enthusiasm undimmed by the pedestrian traffic around us. "Can we get ice cream after the store, Aunt Lena? Please." His voice had that particular quality of persuasion that only a child could achieve. "We'll see," I said, which both of us knew meant yes. I adjusted the small backpack on his shoulders and waited for the light to turn. That's when everything stopped. Not the traffic. The red light held firm, the crosswalk signal blinking its silent refusal. But everything else, my breath, my sense of time, the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon, it all compressed into a single impossible moment. A black car. An Escalade, pristine and immaculate, rolled to a halt 3 cars back. It was the kind of vehicle you didn't see often in this neighborhood, too ostentatious, too deliberately expensive. But it wasn't the car that made my blood slow. It was the man behind the wheel. Even through the tinted glass, I could see him. Dark hair, sharp features, that particular tilt of the head that suggested complete, effortless authority. He was looking at his phone, indifferent to the world around him. Ordinary, almost bored. Then Marco tugged my hand. "Aunt Lena, can we cross?" The light had changed. The walk signal blazed white. But the man in the black car wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking directly at my nephew. I don't know how to describe the shift in his expression. It was like watching a statue wake up. His entire body went still, not the comfortable stillness of someone at rest, but the predatory stillness of something recognizing prey. No, that's not right either. It was recognition. Pure, violent recognition. His eyes, even from that distance, were the same shade of deep brown as Marco's. The same exact shade I'd always noticed, the shade he'd inherited from his mother, my sister. But the cut of his jaw, the high, sharp cheekbones, the particular structure of his face, those were Marco's too. And looking at this man, I suddenly understood where those features had actually come from. "Cross," I whispered. I didn't wait for Marco to move at his normal pace. I swept him up onto my hip, his small weight familiar and grounding, and I walked across that intersection faster than I should have. My heart was a wild thing in my chest, beating so hard I thought I might be sick. I didn't look back. I've learned, since that day, that there are moments when looking back is the worst possible choice. But I felt him watching. Every nerve in my body screamed with the sensation of being hunted. We made it to the other side. I set Marco down and kept walking, pulling him toward the bodega on the corner, then past it, then toward the subway entrance. My hands were shaking. Marco was asking questions. "Why are we running, Aunt Lena? Did you forget something?" But I couldn't quite hear him over the roaring in my ears. I didn't know who that man was. I didn't know his name, or what he wanted, or whether he'd recognized something in Marco that I'd been too careful to ask about. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from pure instinct, that my ordinary life had just ended. The light had changed, and I had crossed into something far more dangerous than any street. I didn't tell anyone about the man in the car. What would I have said? That I'd seen someone at a traffic light, that he'd looked at my nephew with an intensity that suggested ownership. It sounded paranoid when I tried to form the words, even in my own head. Besides, my sister Gianna had enough to worry about. She was 3 months into a grueling surgical residency, pulling double shifts, barely sleeping. The last thing she needed was me spiraling over a stranger's stare. But I changed our routine. I started taking different routes to school pickup. I varied the time we went to the park. I became the kind of aunt who always looked over her shoulder, and Marco began to sense it. Began to absorb the fear like a sponge absorbs water. "You're scared," he said to me on a Thursday, sitting in the children's section of the library where I'd taken him instead of the park. He was right. I was terrified, and I hated that I was letting it show. "I'm not scared," I lied. "I'm just being careful." Off what? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't traumatize a 5-year-old. It was 6 days after the intersection when the first note appeared. I found it taped to the front door of my apartment building. Pristine white envelope with my name written in expensive ink, Lena. Just my first name. Like we were intimate. Like the writer knew me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence, handwritten in the same careful script. "We need to talk about the boy." I read it 4 times. Then I read it backwards, as if the order of the words might change their meaning. They didn't. I called Gianna that night, careful to keep my voice steady, while Marco watched cartoons in the living room. "Did anyone approach you about Marco?" I asked. Anyone strange? Anyone asking questions? My sister's exhale came through the phone like a sigh. Lena, what the hell are you talking about? Jess, did anyone? No. Why? What couldn't tell her? Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening. So I made an excuse about protective instincts and hung up. The note terrified me. But worse than the terror was something else, a pull, a gravity, an inexplicable magnetism toward the idea of him. Who was he? How did he know where I lived? And the question underneath all of those, does he know about Marco's paternity? Because that was the thing I'd never told anyone. The thing I'd helped Gianna hide from everyone, including Marco himself. He was not her biological son. Gianna and her husband Michael had tried for years to have children. Year after year of negative tests, of hope collapsing into despair. They'd been saving for adoption when Gianna's college roommate, a woman named Elena who dropped out of their lives completely, showed up on their doorstep in labor, begging them to take the baby. Elena had disappeared before Marco was a week old. She'd signed papers, walked away, and never been heard from again. Gianna and Michael had never pursued it further. It wasn't relevant. Marco was theirs. He'd always been theirs. But Marco's features had come from somewhere. And that man in the car. The way he'd looked at my nephew like he'd been struck by lightning, like he'd recognized something fundamental in the shape of a child's face. We need to talk about the boy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table and held the note and tried to think. Tried to predict what would happen next. What happened next was worse than a note. He came to my work. I worked as a marketing assistant at a small publishing firm. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would attract the kind of man who drove Escalades and left cryptic messages. I was supposed to be safe there, surrounded by editors and publicists and the gentle bustle of the literary world. I was at my desk, updating a database, when my supervisor appeared at my cubicle with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was fear. Professional fear. The kind that suggested someone very important and very dangerous had appeared in our offices. "There's a man asking for you," she whispered. "In the conference room. Lena, I don't know what this is about, but he's not from around here." Do you understand what I'm saying? I understood. I understood perfectly. I stood on legs that didn't feel like my own and walked toward the conference room. My heart was a fist, pounding against my ribs. He was waiting with his hands clasped in front of him, standing near the window with the city sprawling behind him. He was taller than I'd realized. Older than I'd realized. Maybe in his late 30s. With the kind of face that suggested he'd made difficult choices and never regretted a single one. When he looked at me, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "Ems. Giordano," he said. His voice was soft. "I'm Dante Moretti. We have a great deal to discuss." I couldn't form words. My supervisor hovered in the doorway, uncertain whether to stay. Dante gestured, not looking away from me, and she disappeared. We were alone. "That child," he said quietly. "The boy you were with on 5th Avenue. I need to know everything about him." "I don't." His mother. His full name. His medical history. Everything. The dominance in his voice was absolute. This wasn't a request. It was a demand from someone accustomed to having demands met immediately. "Why?" I whispered. He took a step toward me. Just one, but it felt like the entire room was shrinking. "Because," he said, "looks exactly like me, and I need to know why." I didn't tell him anything that day. What I did was leave work, telling my supervisor I was sick, and I went directly to a lawyer's office. I had the address of one, a family law attorney named Catherine Stone, who'd worked with Gianna on the adoption paperwork years ago. She fit me in between appointments, and I sat in her office with the door closed, and tried to explain the situation while my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Do you know who Dante Moretti is?" she asked. "No. He's the head of one of the largest crime families in the Northeast. Organized crime, money laundering, drug trafficking, possibly weapons dealing, though nothing's ever been proven. He's careful. Meticulous. He doesn't get arrested because he doesn't make mistakes." The room tilted slightly. "What does he want with a 5-year-old child?" I asked. "That," Catherine said carefully, "is the question, isn't it? But I would guess, based on what you've told me, that he believes the boy might be his biological son. How is that possible?" "Marco's mother was Alina. Do you know where Alina came from? Do you know her background?" I shook my head. "Then it's possible she had a connection to Moretti that none of you were aware of. It's possible she was afraid. It's possible she placed the child with your sister specifically to remove him from Moretti's reach. The idea made my stomach turn. Catherine spent the next hour advising me on legal protections, restraining orders, and the general impossibility of restraining someone like Dante Moretti. In the end, what she was really saying was you're in danger, and the law cannot protect you. What do? I asked, honestly. I'd get both you and your sister a security detail. And I'd have a conversation with Marco's biological mother if you can find her. The truth is your only weapon in this situation. I left her office feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. That evening, I called Gianna and told her everything. Not about my fear at the intersection, but about the note, the visit to my work, and the name Dante Moretti. My sister's silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Oh God, she whispered finally. Oh God, Lena. Alina mentioned it once. I made her swear never to. Gianna's voice broke. She was involved with someone dangerous. She wouldn't tell me his name, but she said if anything ever happened to her, if she ever disappeared, I should never let the child know who his real father was. She said it would destroy him. Gianna, where is Alina now? I don't know. She never contacted us again. I have an address she used years ago, but I don't think she's... Send it to me. I spent the next 2 days tracing the ghost of a woman I'd never met. Elena Monteits. That was her full name, pulled from adoption documents I'd previously ignored. Her last known address was an apartment in Hell's Kitchen that a current tenant assured me had been empty for at least 7 years. Her phone number was disconnected. Her social media accounts didn't exist. She'd disappeared as completely as if she'd never been. Which meant I had one option: I had to face Dante Moretti. He made it easy. 3 days after our encounter at my workplace, a car appeared outside my apartment building, sleek, black, and possibly expensive. The driver was a massive man in a suit, and when he opened the back door, he didn't need to say anything. The invitation was implicit. I could have refused. I could have called the police. Instead, I got in. Dante was in the back seat, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up as I sat down. The car pulled into traffic with the smoothness of something weightless, and we drove through the city in silence while the October rain began to fall. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than it had been in the conference room. Not soft now, but intimate, personal. I've been waiting for you to contact me, he said, still not looking at me. I was beginning to think you might force my hand. I don't know anything, I said. I'm sorry. But I don't. About Alina Montes. I don't know where she is. I don't know what your relationship with her was. I only know that she gave her child to my sister. And that child is loved and safe, and whatever you're looking for, whatever you think you're owed. I'm not looking for anything, he said, and now he turned to face me, and I understood why my supervisor had been afraid. There was something in his eyes that suggested he was used to having the world rearrange itself to suit his whims. Accept the truth. He handed me a manila folder. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of Marco. My blood froze. Where did you get these? I whispered. I have resources. Better resources than you can imagine. I've been watching the boy since the moment I saw him. I know his schedule. I know his teachers. I know which park he prefers. I know that he has a birthmark shaped like a compass rose on his right shoulder blade, exactly like the one I have. He pulled back his shirt cuff, and there it was, identical to Marco's, down to the precise shade of brownish, red. God, I breathed. Now, Dante said, you're going to tell me everything. You're going to start with the name Alina Montes and what you know about her. And then you're going to let me meet him. No. The word came out as a whisper. Absolutely not. You don't have a choice. I was shaking, but I forced myself to meet his eyes. I'm not afraid of you, I lied. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, of a lie so transparent it was almost honest. A muscle worked in his jaw. You should be, he said quietly. And you are. But not of me. Not yet. He leaned back in his seat, and the distance he created felt like kindness. Like he was giving me something I hadn't asked for. I'm not gonna hurt you, Lina. He said my name like he'd been practicing it. But I need to know my son, and if you stand in the way of that, I will move you. Gently if I can. But I will move you. He's not your son, I said. He's never been your son. He has my blood. He has my face. That's not debatable. The car pulled over. We were in an underground parking garage, and the sudden silence was suffocating. Think about what I've said, Dante told me. And when you're ready to be reasonable, you'll contact me. In the meantime, I'm going to ensure that you and Marco are protected. My men will be subtle. You won't see them. But they'll be there, because despite what you believe about me, I have no interest in letting him be hurt. He opened the car door. And Lena, if anyone else ever comes for him, they'll answer to me. Not the police, not the law, me. He said it like a promise. I climbed out of that car in a daze. And I didn't look back as it pulled away. My apartment building loomed in front of me, and I had the strange sensation of seeing it for the first time, like I was a prisoner returning to my cell after a brief glimpse of a world I couldn't fully comprehend. Upstairs, Marco was asleep in his bed, his face peaceful, unmarked by the danger that circled him like sharks. I stood in his doorway and wondered if Gianna had ever felt the weight of this, the impossible burden of protecting a child from forces larger than yourself. I hadn't known until that moment that I was in love with Dante Moretti. Or, perhaps more accurately, I hadn't known until that moment that fear and love were sometimes the same thing, and that wanting someone to be destroyed and wanting him to hold, you could occupy the exact same space in your heart. It took 5 days for me to understand the magnitude of what had happened. The first sign was subtle. I went to pick up Marco from school, and there was a man sitting in a car across the street. He was reading a newspaper, but he watched me the entire time I was there. The second time I noticed another man, different face. Same intensity of surveillance, standing in the coffee shop where I usually grabbed lunch. By the third day, I'd stopped pretending I couldn't see them. They weren't threatening. That was the most terrifying part. They were professional. Invisible. The kind of men who could watch you forever and never be seen. I called Gianna and told her what was happening. She wanted to go to the police. I didn't bother explaining why the police would be useless against someone like Dante Moretti. Instead, I told her to stay calm and let me handle it. What I meant was I'll figure out how to surrender, because that's what this was. He was herding me toward inevitability, removing my options one at a time until compliance was the only choice remaining. He was doing it without violence, without even direct communication, which somehow made it worse. The leverage was subtle and absolute. You can resist, and I will ensure your lives become increasingly complicated. Or you can let me meet the boy. On the 6th day after the car ride, my apartment building was flooded. A pipe burst on the floor above mine, and water cascaded through my ceiling like a biblical plague. The landlord was apologetic but unmoved. The building would need significant repairs, and the apartments were uninhabitable for at least 2 weeks. I had nowhere to go but Gianna's house. That night, as I was packing Marco's bags, I found a business card slipped into my purse. Cream-colored stock, minimalist design. On the back, an address and a single line of handwriting. When you're ready. I knew that address. I'd looked it up days ago, a private estate in Westchester, 40 minutes north of the city. The kind of place where men like Dante Moretti disappeared into privacy. I called him. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting by the phone. I want to talk to Elena, I said without preamble. Elena is dead. He said it matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. She died 4 years ago. Overdose. Though the police never found enough evidence to prove it wasn't accidental. She was a troubled woman. The world tilted. And you didn't think to tell me this. You didn't think it was relevant. I didn't think you needed context. I thought you needed leverage to understand that the boy is alone. That he needs protection. That I'm the only one who can give it to him. You're using his mother's death as a bargaining chip. I'm using it as fact, Downey said. The boy has no one. You are his guardian. And you have my gratitude for that. But he has my blood. He has my legacy. And whether you like it or not, he's going to be a target for anyone who wants to hurt me. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream. Instead, I found myself asking, why? Because I have enemies. Because I have business interests that aren't always legal. Because I exist in a world where people like me create people like enemies. The boy is safer if he understands that world, if he's prepared for it. He's 5 years old. Now, he won't be 5 forever. The implication hung between us, that he was planning a future with Marco in it, a future I had no control over. Come to the house, Dante said. You can see him with your own eyes. You can understand that he won't be hurt. And then, when you're ready to let him be part of my life, you will. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no either. 3 days later, with Marco packed into the car and Gianna's worried eyes following us from the window, I drove north on a gray afternoon, following the GPS coordinates toward a mansion that existed in a kind of shadow outside the real world. The gates opened as we approached, electronic, automatic. Like they knew we were coming. The driveway wound through property that seemed to go on forever, And then suddenly we were there. A house that looked like it had been designed to demonstrate absolute power. Not garish, tasteful. Expensive in a way that whispered rather than screamed. Marble and stone and windows that reflected the dying light like eyes. A woman was waiting on the porch, older, stern-faced, with the bearing of someone who ran household operations with an iron will. "I'm Maria," she said. "Mr. Moretti is waiting inside. The boy can come with me. There's a room prepared for him." Marco grabbed my hand. "Aunt Lena, where are we?" "It's okay," I said, and I hated myself for lying to him. "We're visiting someone. You can go with Maria for a little bit." He looked uncertain, but he let go of my hand and took Maria's instead. I watched them disappear into the house, and the moment they were gone, I felt the absence like a physical thing. Dante emerged from the front door, silhouetted against the amber light from inside. He was in his shirt sleeves, dark slacks, expensive shoes. He looked like someone who'd just stepped out of a meeting about money or violence or both. "Come inside," he said. I didn't move. "If you try anything." "I'm not going to try anything," he said. "I'm going to show you that he's safe. And then I'm going to ask you to understand that the world is built by men like me. And your only choice is whether to accept it or resist it until it breaks you." I followed him inside. The house was immaculate in a way that suggested no one actually lived in it. Everything was clean, ordered, perfect, but there was no evidence of humanity. No photographs on the walls, no books on the tables, no small accidents of living. Dante led me through corridors that seemed to extend forever, and I realized with a start that I was in the home of a man I barely knew, surrounded by his power, with no escape route I could identify. He brought me to a library. Floor-to-ceiling books, a fireplace, leather chairs positioned near a window overlooking grounds that seemed to disappear into infinity. "Marco is having dinner with Maria in the kitchen," he said. "He's completely safe. She raised my nephew for years. She's better with children than most people are with anyone." I sat down because my legs demanded it, and he sat across from me, the firelight between us like a barrier. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Why would I do that?" "Because we're going to know each other very well. And it's better to start with honesty. We're not going to know each other at all. This is temporary. You're going to realize that Marco isn't your responsibility. And you'll move on to whatever crime you were committing before." "Lena," he said, and hearing my name in his mouth made something inside me contract. I've never moved on from anything in my life. I accumulate, I protect, I own, and I don't let go. The way he said it wasn't threatening. It was intimate. "You're a criminal," I said. "Less. You've probably hurt people." "Almost certainly. And you want a relationship with a 5-year-old child. I want him to grow up understanding who he is, where he comes from, what he'll inherit. The world won't change, Lena. Men like me will still exist. The only question is whether Marco understands that and learns to navigate it, or whether he's blindsided by it when he's old enough that ignorance becomes dangerous. That's not parenting. That's indoctrination." Dante stood and walked to the window. For a long moment he was silent, looking out at the darkness. "My father," he said finally, "believed in the same kind of power that I do. He built an empire, and he expected me to inherit it. I was trained from childhood, taught how to negotiate, how to read people, how to understand what men want, and how to use that against them. By the time I was 18, I was already moving money through shell corporations. By 25, I had to decide whether to expand his operation or try to escape it. He turned back to me. I didn't escape, and part of me has always wondered what my life would have looked like if I had a choice. If my father had wanted me to be anything other than what he made me. So you're going to give Marco that choice. I'm going to give him the choice I never had. But I'm also going to make sure he understands the world well enough that he can survive it. I won't survive it by being your son," I said. "He'll be a target. He's already a target. The moment he was born with my face, with my blood, he became a target. I'm just the only person strong enough to protect him from all the other threats." He said it with such certainty that for a moment, I believed him. Maria appeared in the doorway. "The boy is tired. He's asking for you." I stood immediately and followed her out of the library, relieved to escape the magnetic pull of Dante's presence. Marco was in a sitting room, surrounded by toys he'd clearly never played with, on a couch that was far too large for him. "Lena!" He scrambled toward me. "This house is huge, like a castle!" And Maria made the best food. I picked him up and held him, and he was warm and solid and completely, blissfully unaware of anything beyond his immediate contentment. "We're going to stay here for a few days," I told him. Is that okay? He nodded, already sleepy. Is the man staying here too? My heart stopped. Which man? The man who looks like me. Maria said his name is Dante. She said we have the same chin. I glanced at Maria, who was watching me with no expression. Yes, I said finally. He lives here. Does he know good stories? I don't know. We can ask him. By the time I got Marco into bed in a guest room that was decorated with the kind of tasteful restraint of someone who didn't want to be mistaken for someone who understood children, he was already half asleep. I sat on the edge of the mattress and watched him breathe and tried to imagine a version of the future where this wasn't a disaster. I found Dante in the library again, exactly where I'd left him. He asked if you knew good stories. I said, I probably don't, but I can try. I nodded. And then I didn't know what to do with myself. Stay standing. Sit. Make conversation with a criminal who seemed determined to become an intimate part of my life whether I consented or not. You should sleep, Dante said. Maria will show you to your room. I'm not staying. You are. I've already told your sister that you'll be here for a week. It's safer than the apartment in the city while it's being repaired. You're insane? I'm strategic. There's a difference. The room he'd prepared for me was beautiful in the same way the rest of the house was beautiful, expensive, comfortable, completely impersonal. I lay in the enormous bed and listened to the silence of a house where people move like ghosts and realized that I'd somehow become prisoner and guest simultaneously. The next morning, Dante brought Marco to find me at breakfast. My nephew was animated, excited, glowing with the particular children experience when someone powerful has decided to pay attention to them. He taught me how to play chess, Marco announced. He said I'm very smart. That's wonderful, I said, looking at Dante with something between gratitude and fury. He was manipulating the situation, yes, but he was doing it so gently that I couldn't quite bring myself to hate him for it. Every day that week, the walls closed in a little tighter. Dante spent time with Marco in the mornings, teaching him games, telling him edited versions of stories that probably had no right to be edited into child-appropriate versions. In the afternoons, Marco napped and I was alone with Dante in the library or on the grounds. We didn't touch. That was what shocked me most. Despite the isolation, despite the forced proximity, he maintained a distance that bordered on ascetic. But there was something worse about the distance than if he'd simply pulled me close. There was something about being wanted from across the room that made me understand, for the first time, what the phrase, slow burn, actually meant. Why aren't you married? I asked him on the 5th day. I've never seen the point, he said. Marriage is a contract for normal people. People who can have normal lives. People who won't turn their spouse into a target. So you're going to be alone forever. I'm not alone. I have business. I have people who work for me. I have a nephew. He paused, correcting himself. A son, connections. That's enough. But the way he said it sounded like a lie. What about love? I asked, before I could stop myself. He turned to look at me, and something in his expression shifted, like I'd asked the one question he'd been avoiding his entire life. I wouldn't know how, he said finally. I was never taught it. And I don't think I'm capable of it in the way normal people are. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to tell him that anyone was capable of love, but I was beginning to suspect that he was right, that whatever he felt for Marco, whatever he might feel for me, was something darker and more complex. Not love, possession, obsession, the need to protect what he considered his, and terrifyingly, I was starting to want that obsession directed at me. On the 7th day, I said we had to leave. Gianna needed me back. Marco's school needed consistency. The apartment was repaired enough that we could return. These were all true things, but they were also excuses. I was losing myself in Dante's house the way an object loses itself to gravity, slowly at first and then all at once. He didn't argue. That might have been worse than if he had. Instead, he walked me to the car while Marco said goodbye to Maria, and he stood there in the morning light looking like a man carved from marble, and he asked, "What would it take for you to come back?" "Nothing," I said. "We need to establish distance." "We need to. When do you want me to see him again?" The question was so reasonable, so paternal that I nearly broke. Every other weekend, I found myself saying, "If you want, but I'm driving him." "Nah, agreed, and you'll maintain distance. Respectful distance. You won't use surveillance anymore. You won't. I'll always have men watching," he said quietly. "But you're right. They'll be less visible. And I won't visit your apartment unannounced." "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me. I'm not doing this for you. When he said my name, it wasn't a command or a claim. It was a question, like he was asking permission to feel whatever was stirring behind his eyes. I know, I said. The drive back to the city felt like moving underwater. Marco talked the entire time about the house, about Dante, about the chess lessons and the garden and the room full of books. He wanted to go back immediately. He wanted to know if Dante was his father. He wanted to know why I'd never mentioned that he had a man with the same face in his life. It's complicated, I told him, but he's nice. Maria said he's a very important man. Yes, he's very important. That weekend, Dante picked Marco up from my apartment. He arrived at the exact time we'd agreed in the black Escalade, without men visible but certainly present. He was wearing jeans and a casual shirt, things I'd never seen him in, and he looked less dangerous and somehow more frightening. When Marco ran toward him with pure joy on his face, Dante caught him and lifted him up, and for a moment, just a moment, something raw crossed his features. Vulnerability, the recognition of something he was suddenly responsible for. Be good for your aunt, he told Marco, and be safe. I will, Marco promised. Will you teach me more chess? Better than chess. I'll teach you how to think like a strategist. How to see 10 moves ahead. I felt my heart fracture a little. After he left with Marco, I went back to my apartment and did something I hadn't done in days. I cried. Not quietly. The kind of crying that involves the entire body. The kind that leaves you exhausted and raw. Because I was beginning to understand what was happening. I wasn't just trapped in Dante's orbit because he'd forced me there. I was trapped there because some part of me, the part that had always been soft, always been seeking protection, always been looking for someone stronger than myself, had recognized him as a solution to a loneliness I'd been carrying my entire life. My phone rang the next morning. It was him. Marco wants you to come to the house this weekend, he said without preamble. He doesn't understand why you're not there. He thinks it's his fault. That's emotional manipulation. Less, Dante agreed calmly, but it's also true. Will you come? I shouldn't. I know. There was silence on the line. I could hear the weight of everything unspoken. All the ways he wanted me, all the ways I wanted him, all the ways we were both probably terrible for each other. I'll come, I said. That weekend, I stayed from Friday to Sunday. The next weekend, I stayed Monday morning. The weekend after that, I wasn't sure if I was visiting or moving in. Dante never pushed. That was the cruelty of it. He simply created an environment where being with him was easier than being without him. Where Marco was happy, where my presence mattered. Where every small comfort was provided with the kind of attention that suggested he'd anticipated my needs before I'd articulated them. It was 3 weeks after that first stay that it happened. Marco was asleep. It was late, and I was sitting in the library like I'd been that first night, only this time Dante was closer. Sitting in the chair next to mine instead of across the room. My father wanted me to do things. He said without preamble. Violent things. Things I'm not going to do to Marco, no matter what happens. I didn't know what to say. I waited, but he'll know who I am, Dante continued. He'll understand that power is currency. That protection isn't free. That the world doesn't care about your innocence. He paused. I'm trying to give him something I never had, a choice. But I don't know how to do that without losing control. Without losing him. It was the most vulnerable I'd ever heard him sound. You won't lose him, I said. Not if you actually give him the choice. I'm not good at letting things go. Lena, I know, I want to keep you both of you. Permanently. My breath caught. You can't just decide that. Relationships don't work like that. Mine do, he said. I decide. I commit. And nothing moves me from that commitment. That's not love. That's ownership. Maybe. He turned to look at me. But it's what I'm capable of. It's what I'm offering. I should have stood up. I should have walked out of that library and driven back to the city and closed that door forever. Instead, I found myself asking, what does it feel like to be you, lonely? He said, and the honesty of it broke something in me. It feels lonely. I reached over and I took his hand. My fingers were shaking. His were absolutely steady. I don't want this. I whispered. I know, I'm afraid of you. Yes, I think you might hurt me. You're right, it's possible. It's probable, actually. I hurt everything I touch eventually. Then why am I still here? He brought my hand to his chest, and I could feel his heart beating under my palm, strong and steady and utterly, terrifyingly alive. Because, he said, I'm not going to let you leave. The moment before everything changed, I thought about Marco. I thought about my nephew sleeping safely in a room 2 floors above us, protected by men who would die rather than let him be harmed. I thought about how his laughter had changed in the weeks we'd been coming to this house, less cautious now, more fully realized. I thought about how he'd started to look at Dante the way children look at their heroes, like Dante contained the answer to every question, held the solution to every fear. And I realized that by staying, I'd already made the choice for both of us. Donnie stood, and I stood with him, our hands still connected. The library felt very small suddenly, the room shrinking down to just this, him and me and the space between us. If we do this, I said, and my voice was unsteady, uncertain, nothing changes. We're not together. Not in the way you. He brought his other hand up to my face. Just one hand, just the side of my cheek, but it felt like he was holding my entire world in his palm. I'm going to change my mind, he said. I'm going to decide that I want you to stay forever. I'm going to decide that Marco needs you and that I need you, and I'm going to make that choice permanent. You can't just decide. I already have. He kissed me before I could protest further. I'd been expecting brutality. I'd been expecting dominance expressed through physical force. What I got instead was restraint so profound it felt like tenderness, and that was somehow more devastating. His mouth was gentle against mine. His hand in my hair was careful, like I was something precious that might break. When he pulled back, I was trembling. We should stop. I whispered. Do you want to stop? I didn't answer. We both knew I didn't want to stop. He took my hand and led me upstairs, through corridors that seemed to exist outside of normal space and time. When we reached his bedroom, a vast, immaculate space that felt more like a museum than anywhere a person actually lived, he closed the door carefully, like the sound of it shutting was important. Tell me if you want to stop, he said. Tell me if anything feels wrong. I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. He sat down on the edge of the bed and he drew me between his legs and he held my waist gently, like I was learning the shape of his hands. I'm scared, I whispered. I know. I don't know what to do. You don't have to do anything. Just let me. He undressed me with a careful deliberation that suggested he'd thought about this, imagined this, planned this out in perfect detail. Each piece of clothing removed became something sacred, my shirt, my pants, my undergarments. He never rushed. He never grabbed. His hands moved like he was reading me, trying to understand the language of my body. When I was bare in front of him, I wanted to cover myself, wanted to apologize for my ordinary softness, wanted to become someone else entirely. He stopped me with a hand against my waist. You're perfect, he said. And he said it like it was a fact he'd verified through research. I'm not. You are. Don't argue with me about this. He drew me closer and he kissed my collarbone and then lower, and my head fell back because I couldn't support it anymore. I was dissolving. I was coming apart into nothing, and he was the only thing holding me together. When he stopped, he was still fully clothed, and I was lying on his bed unable to form coherent thoughts. Why did you stop? My voice sounded like someone else's. Because, he said, I need you to understand something. This isn't what you think it is. This isn't a moment. This is a beginning. He stripped off his clothes with no ceremony, and I saw his body for the first time, lean and powerful, scarred in places that suggested violence, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. When he came back to me, he was careful still, but there was an intensity to it now, a hunger that had been held in check and was finally released. Tell me if you need to stop. He whispered against my neck. I didn't stop. I couldn't have stopped if my life depended on it. It wasn't the violent passion I might have expected from him. It was intimate and slow and almost gentle, except for the moments when it wasn't, when I felt the edge of his need, the depth of his desire, and I realized that everything about this man was controlled because the alternative was chaos. When he entered me, I gasped, and he stilled immediately. Are you okay? Yes, I breathed. Yes, just don't stop. So he didn't. He moved inside me with a kind of reverence, like he was worshipping something. Like I was a mystery he'd finally been granted access to solve. My body responded to him in ways I didn't know were possible, waves of pleasure that built and built until I was gasping his name. When I came, it was like breaking, like shattering, like being unmade and remade simultaneously. Dante followed me, his body going taut, his breathing ragged, and I felt him lose control for the first time since I'd met him. I felt him need me in a way that transcended possession, that bordered on desperation. Afterward, we lay tangled together, and he was still holding me like I might disappear. Don't, he said against my hair. Don't what? Don't regret this. Don't leave. Don't decide that this was a mistake. I can't promise that. He was quiet for a long moment, then promised that you'll stay tonight. That's all I'm asking, I promised. And I stayed. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, while he slept beside me, I understood that the walls hadn't just closed around me. They'd swallowed me whole. The attack happened on a Tuesday that felt like any other Tuesday. I'd gotten used to the rhythm of life at the house, mornings with Marco before school, afternoons at my publishing job, evenings back at the estate, nights in Dante's bed. It wasn't a life I'd chosen, but it was a life I'd started to inhabit like it had been designed for me. Dante rarely discussed his work with me. Sometimes there would be men in suits who came and went, conversations that happened in rooms where I wasn't permitted, phone calls taken on balconies where his voice would drop to a tone I didn't recognize. But mostly, when I was around, he simply existed as Marco's father, as my lover, as someone who had learned impossibly to be tender. That Tuesday he left the house early. Business, he'd said, kissing my forehead. I'll be back by 6. He wasn't back by 6, or 7, or 8. I was putting Marco to bed when Maria found me, her face a careful mask of nothing. You should come to the front sitting room, she said quietly. My heart had already started to race. Dante was there, but he wasn't alone. He was covered in blood. Not his blood, I understood that immediately, though it didn't slow my panic. There were 3 other men with him, equally stained, and the smell of violence was in the room like a presence. Lena. Dante's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Go upstairs. What happened? Are you hurt? Go upstairs. No, tell me what happened. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, deciding whether to shield me or let me see the full weight of who he was. He chose truth. Someone made a move against us, he said quietly. Against you and Marco specifically. They found out you were here and they decided to use you as leverage. My blood stopped moving. I handled it, Dante continued. The threat is eliminated. You and Marco are safe. Handled, I repeated numbly. What does that mean? It means, he said, and now I heard the thin edge of violence in his voice, the quality I'd sensed lurking beneath his control, that 6 men decided their lives meant less than your safety. I proved that hypothesis. I should have been horrified. I should have run. Instead, I walked toward him, and I took his blood-stained hands in mine. Show me, I said. He led me to a bathroom on the 2nd floor and he washed the blood from his skin like ritual. The water ran red. And with each movement, I saw the careful precision of a man who'd been trained in violence from childhood, who moved through it like others moved through water. This is who I am, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a reckoning, a final truth he was laying at my feet. I know, I whispered. You're afraid of me. I'm terrified. But you're not leaving. It wasn't a question either. No, I said. I'm not leaving. When he pulled me close, he was careful not to get blood on my clothes. That small consideration somehow made it worse, the fact that even in his violence, he was thinking about protecting me. They were going to take you, he said against my neck. They were going to take you and Marco and use you to control me. I couldn't allow that. I know. I'll always do that. If anyone ever threatens you, I'll destroy them. Not the law, not negotiation. Destruction. I know. I repeated, and I realized I'd known this from the moment I saw him at the red light. Some part of me had always understood that Dante's love would be expressed through violence, that his protection would require the kind of ruthlessness I could barely comprehend. And I was staying anyway. That night, after Marco was asleep, after the house had been cleaned and the evidence disposed of and the men sent away, I stood in Dante's bedroom and I realized I was weeping. He came to me and he held me, and he didn't ask why. He understood that I was grieving, not for the men who'd died, but for the life I could have had. The ordinary life with an ordinary man. The safety of normalcy. Instead, I had a man who would commit murder to keep me alive, who would burn the world down if it meant protecting Marco, who loved me in the only way he was capable of loving, completely, absolutely, dangerously. Stay, he whispered. I'm already staying, I said. Stay permanently. Marry me. Let me make it legal. I pulled back and looked at him. His eyes were desperate in a way I'd never seen them, like this was the one thing he couldn't control through force, the one thing he couldn't acquire with money. You're insane, I whispered. Yes. You're a criminal. Demonstrably? And you want me to bind myself to you legally. I want you to admit that you already are bound to me. I want it on record. I want Marco to know his parents are committed to each other. I can't. You can. You are. You already have. I pulled away from him and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds he owned, the kingdom he'd built, the prison he'd made beautiful enough that I wanted to stay. If I say yes, I said slowly, it's on conditions. You stop the surveillance on me. You let me have my own life outside this house. You don't control. I'll always control, he said quietly. It's my nature. But I can learn to control less. I can give you freedom to move within the space I keep safe for you. It wasn't what I would have asked for, but it was more than I'd expected. Yes, I said, and the word hung in the room like something alive. He said it then just once, not twice. The words I'd known were coming. You're mine. I didn't protest. How could I? The wedding happened in the mansion's garden, on a gray November afternoon, with only the essential people present: Gianna, Michael, Marco, Maria, and the lawyer who made it all legal. No church. No witnesses beyond those who already understood what I was becoming. Dante dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. When he looked at me in my simple cream dress, something in him visibly softened. You're beautiful, he said, and he said it like he was surprised every time. I'm terrified, I said. I know. What if I regret this in 5 years? What if Marco resents me for this? Then we'll adjust. But I don't think you will. He was right. Though it took me longer to admit it than he would have wanted, the first month of marriage was strangely domestic. We fell into rhythms: breakfast together, Marco's school, my part-time work that I'd negotiated back into my life, evenings with the three of us. Dante was more present than I'd expected, more willing to let the boundaries of his work stay separate from our home life. But there were consequences to what he'd done. The men he'd killed had families. Rivals who interpreted his violence as weakness rebranded. Deals that had been delicate suddenly became complicated. I knew this when I married him. But knowing something intellectually is different from living it. The phone calls started in the second month. Coded conversations that Dante would take alone. The sudden arrival of security measures, additional men, new protocols for moving through the city, restrictions on where Marco could go. This will pass, Dante told me when I asked what was happening. Someone will challenge my leadership, and I'll suppress the challenge, and everyone will settle back into their hierarchy. People are going to be hurt. Less. More deaths, probably, and you're just accepting this. Lena, he said, and his voice was tired in a way I'd never heard it. I've been accepting violence my entire life. It's not ideal, but it's the world we live in, and I'm doing everything in my power to keep you and Marco separate from it. But we're not separate. We're here. We're part of it. Yes, he agreed. You are. But you can choose what kind of participation you want. You can stay in this house and not know the details. You can have your small, sheltered life within my larger, darker life. That sounds lonely. It's survival. In the third month, the violence escalated. 2 of Dante's warehouses were hit. A business rival was assassinated in a way that made the news but offered no leads. Dante came home sometimes bloodied, sometimes with the careful blankness of someone who'd just killed, and I realized that I had a choice to make. I could leave. Dante would let me. I understood that now. He would never hold me against my will, not really. He could control the environment, but not my fundamental consent. If I truly wanted to walk away, he would let me go. But I wouldn't take Marco. Because Marco had already made his choice. My nephew loved this man. He loved the security Dante provided, the attention, the consistency. He loved having a father who was present and powerful, and wholly devoted to his safety. So I would be choosing between my freedom and my family. On a night when Dante was dealing with some new complication, I sat with Gianna in the library of the house I now owned a share of, and I asked her the question I'd been afraid to ask. Do you hate me for marrying him? My sister was quiet for a long moment. I hate what this means for you, she said finally. I hate that you're tied to a man who lives in violence. I hate that Marco is growing up with a father who could be taken from him at any moment. But I don't hate you. And watching how he is with you, watching how he's learned to be gentle because you needed that from him, I can see that maybe this isn't a mistake. Maybe it's just the most complicated love story that ever existed. It doesn't feel like love, I said. It feels like possession, like I've been swallowed. Love is possession, Gianna said softly. We just usually hide it better, but Dante doesn't hide anything. That's actually more honest than what most people do. I stayed. Not because I was trapped, but because I chose to. Every day, I woke up and I made the decision to stay, with this man, in this house, in this life that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And maybe that was what real love was. Not the movies, not the fairy tales, not the moment of surrender, but the million moments after, where you choose to stay despite knowing every reason you should leave. In the 4th month, Dante finally took me to see the operation. We went underground, into spaces beneath the mansion that I didn't know existed. There were men there, dozens of them, watching screens, managing money, directing operations. And there, under the house where Marco was sleeping, was the engine that drove everything. "This is what I do," Dante said calmly. "This is what you married. This is what our son will eventually understand is his legacy." "He won't have to do this," I said. "You promised. He won't have to. But he'll understand it. He'll know that his father built an empire, and he'll have to decide whether to expand it or walk away. I didn't have that choice. I'm giving it to him." I looked at the screens, at the men working, at the machinery of crime laid bare, and I didn't feel the horror I expected. I felt something closer to understanding. This was Dante's world. This was his meaning. This was how he'd learned to care for people, by controlling everything around them until safety was absolute. It wasn't conventional, but it was genuine. The year that followed was a strange recalibration of what normal could be. Dante's rivals consolidated their fear of him. The violence didn't stop, but it became more predictable. A language spoken between families, understood by everyone involved. Marco started 1st grade. I went back to full-time work, though Dante never quite stopped having men watch me. It became a joke between us. The only way he knew how to love was to ensure nothing could ever surprise him. I learned to live with it. There was a morning in September, 1 year after our wedding, when Marco came to breakfast bubbling with excitement about a school project. He was making a family tree, and he wanted to know stories about his parents. About me, about Dante, about how we'd met. Dante was quiet while Marco ate his cereal and talked, but I could feel him listening with the kind of intensity he brought to everything. Later, in the study, he pulled me close. "He's going to ask more questions," Dante said. "He's going to want to understand who he is, what I do, whether he wants that life or something different. I know. I'm not going to lie to him. But I'm also not going to force him into anything. I know that too." He kissed my forehead, and it was such a simple gesture, so ordinary, that it struck me how far we'd come. How a man who'd learned to express everything through control and violence had learned, slowly, to express himself through tenderness. "I'm going to lose you someday," he said suddenly. "You're insane. I'm realistic. Someone will come for you to hurt me, or you'll realize that you want a normal life. Or age will take you. That's the only reality I haven't been able to control. You can't control death." "No, I can't. And it terrifies me." I pulled back and looked at him. "So what do you do about it?" "I love you harder," he said. "Every day, I love you harder. Because I know it might be the last day I get to do this." That night, I lay beside him in the darkness, and I understood that this was as happy as either of us would ever be. Not happy in the way ordinary people experience it, but happy in a deeper sense. Happy in the way that comes from being truly known by someone. Being wanted precisely as you are. By someone who could have demanded you be different. The phone call came 3 weeks later. Dante took it in the study, and I heard the shift in his voice from the other room. The quality changed, became sharper, more dangerous. When he emerged, there was a particular kind of darkness in his eyes. "Someone's coming for you," he said flatly. "Not immediately, but within the month. An old rival of my father's. Someone who knows exactly how to hurt me." "How do you know this?" "Intelligence, men I trust. The same men who've kept us safe this long." "What do? We wait, and when they come I stop them, like I've always stopped everything that threatens you." I felt something solidify inside my chest. "And if you can't stop them, I will," he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute. The attack came at night, exactly as he'd predicted. I woke to the sound of gunfire, distant, controlled, the sound of a security system being tested. Dante was already out of bed, already moving with that terrible, practiced grace that spoke of a man who'd been trained for violence from childhood. "Stay here," he said. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "Dante, stay here." He kissed me once, quick and fierce, and then he was gone. I locked the door as instructed, and I sat on the edge of the bed with my heart in my throat. The sounds of the attack were muffled from our bedroom, but present. Gunfire, shouts, the crash of something breaking. And underneath it all, the terrible silence of waiting. Marco. My first thought was for Marco. I ran to his room and found him already awake, terrified, clutching his stuffed animal. I pulled him into bed with me and held him, and tried to convey through my body that everything was okay even as I heard Dante's voice, distant and cold, giving orders to his men. It was over in 20 minutes. When Dante came to us, he was bleeding from a wound on his shoulder, but he was smiling. The kind of smile that suggested he'd just resolved something that had been bothering him. "It's done," he said. "He's dealt with. No one's coming after us again?" I didn't ask for details. I'd learned that some things were better not knowing. In the weeks after, we settled back into our life. Dante healed. Marco went back to school. I continued my work. But something had shifted in me. I understood finally that I would never leave this man. Not because I was trapped, but because I'd chosen to stay. Every day, with full knowledge of who he was and what he did, I chose him, and he chose us. In the only way he knew how, with absolute, unwavering devotion expressed through control and protection, and a love so intense it bordered on frightening. On a gray afternoon in November, exactly 2 years after we'd met at a red light, Dante took me to the garden where we'd been married. Marco was in school. The house was quiet. "I want another child," he said. "Our child. Not his, not ours by accident. Actually ours." "You're insane?" I said, which had become my standard response to his more dramatic revelations. "Yes, but I want this. I want to build something with you that's ours from the beginning." I thought about it. About a child who would grow up knowing exactly who their father was. Who would have the security that Dante insisted on, but also, I hoped, the softness that I could provide. Who would exist at the intersection of light and dark, of safety and danger, of love expressed as ownership. "Okay," I said. "Let's make a baby." Dante smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd never learned how to want things gently, who'd only learned how to take what he needed, but who was trying for me, for Marco, for this strange, beautiful family we'd built, to be different. The future remained dark. There would always be dangers. There would always be rivals. There would always be the possibility that I would lose him to violence, or that some threat would emerge that even his power couldn't control. But I'd chosen this. With full eyes, with full knowledge, I'd chosen this man and this life in this darkness, and he'd chosen me. That, in the end, was all the light we had.